This was the introduction of the Mikoyan-Gurevich MiG-15 jet fighter, part of Stalin's technical support to China. At the time, both the US and UN Air Forces were flying a mix of wartime piston-engine fighters, like the Mustang, and the straight-wing first-generation jet fighters like the Lockheed F-80 Shooting Star and the Grumman F-9F Panther. Benefiting from captured Nazi German research, and ironically, British jet technology gifted as a token of friendship to the Soviet Union, the swept-wing MiG-15 easily outclassed these aircraft and threatened to wrestle away control of the air. What shocked the UN pilots more than anything was how well the MiG-15s were flown by the North Koreans and Chinese, which led to the correct assumption that they were in fact fighting the Soviets themselves. Stalin had sent some of his most experienced pilots to train his communist allies and engage UN air power whenever it ventured over communist-held territory. However, they were under strict instructions never to fly over UN-held territory, for the fear of them being captured and revealing that Soviets were indeed fighting in the war in some capacity, despite Stalin's reservations. American bomber crews, again flying World War II vintage aircraft, such as the Boeing B-29 Superfortress, would be savaged by this new fighter, which cut them down with its exceptionally heavy armament that included a punishing 37mm cannon. This forced the USAF to reluctantly deploy its own swept-wing fighter to counter the MiG-15, the recently delivered North American F-86A Sabre, and the coming battles between the two types would ascend into near legendary status in the annals of aviation history, while at the same time making the MiG a household name, representing communist air power in the United States for decades to follow. MacArthur had been incensed by the Chinese intervention and the reversal of UN fortunes, and so planned a new offensive aimed at crushing the PVA and achieving victory within the final 2 months of 1950. However, the PVA's commander, General Peng Dehuai, had anticipated this move and had already worked up a counteroffensive. On November 6, 1950, the PVA withdrew north of the Chosin Reservoir, a man-made lake whose name actually derived from the captured Japanese Army maps of the region, hoping to lure in the US Marines to the south. MacArthur ordered the USMC's 10th Corps to attack west of the reservoir in order to cut off communist supply lines in the area, unaware that the PVA had managed to sneak their 9th Army into the area to ambush the Americans. On November 24th, MacArthur's plan was put into action, which became known as the Home by Christmas Offensive. The next day, both sides clashed bitterly along the banks of the Chongchon River, when the PVA's 13th Army achieved total surprise against the US 8th Army. 2 days later, on November 27th, the 9th Army attacked the US Marines near the reservoir, which was now frozen over, and the area blanketed by snow during the typically heavy North Korean winter. The US Marines, along with elements of both the US and South Korean armies, as well as the British Royal Marines 41 Independent Commando, numbered 30,000 men in total. but they were soon encircled by 120,000 communist troops. For 17 days, the Ninth Army tried to destroy the UN troops, who were kept alive thanks largely to airdrops of supplies. But the UN troops never broke, and were eventually able to break out of their encirclement and undertake a fighting retreat to the port of Hangnam. The UN troops fighting there soon adopted the name the Chosen Few, and the battle has become firmly embedded in the history of the USMC as a demonstration of the service's true grit in the face of the enemy. Yet despite examples of such tenacity on the part of UN forces, the sheer volume of Chinese flowing south acted like a tsunami on the strategic map of the Korean peninsula. Such was their size. Chinese troops often engaged in human wave assaults, during which many UN tank crews found themselves having to rotate their turrets to brush off swarms of Chinese clamoring on their hulls, often armed with little more than a single hand grenade. Such was the short supply of adequate anti-armor weapons for the PVA. Fighting at Chosin and along the Chongchon River had cost MacArthur 18,000 and 11,000 troops respectively. MacArthur's offensive was clearly no longer possible, and the UN was in retreat once more, being beaten back to the 38th parallel. MacArthur was forced to cable his superiors in Washington with the words, "We face an entirely new war." In terms of gains, at the start of 1951, the 6-month-old Korean War was in stalemate, but the speed at which the PVA had turned back the US and UN sent Chinese confidence of achieving a total victory soaring. Thus, rather than sue for peace, having secured North Korea, the Chinese instead followed MacArthur's force across the 38th. And on January 4th, Seoul once again fell to the Communists, as did Incheon the next day, before their forces began to run out of steam a week later, being ground to a crawl by a stiff UN resistance and superior air power. Then, on January 25th, the US 8th Army counterattacked the Chinese western flank and began pushing back towards the east. Beyond the battlefield, attempts to negotiate a ceasefire failed, and on February 1st, the UN passed Resolution 498, openly branding the People's Republic of China as the aggressor in the ongoing war. At the same time, MacArthur was making inroads to Truman about the use of atom bombs in a last-ditch effort to save South Korea. Truman, being the only president to authorize the use of atomic weapons in combat, MacArthur thought he would be receptive to the idea. However, this proved not to be the case. Truman had examined possible atomic options in Korea, but most of his key allies in the war, most notably Britain, was vehemently opposed to the idea, leading him to shelve them, despite having nuclear-armed bombers based in Guam in preparation. MacArthur also examined the idea of using radioactive waste to create an impassable barrier along the 38th parallel. Explaining this idea to author Bob Considine in 1964, he said, "It was my plan as our amphibious forces moved south to spread behind us, from the Sea of Japan to the Yellow Sea, a belt of radioactive cobalt. it could have been spread from wagons, carts, trucks, and planes. It is not an expensive material. It has an active life of between 60 and 120 years. For at least 60 years, there could be no land invasion of Korea from the north. The enemy could not have marched across that radiated collar I proposed to put across Korea's neck. As the battle lines ebbed and flowed, on February 10th, Incheon was retaken by UN forces. But on the 11th, the Chinese launched an assault to the west, which forced UN troops back to the city of Wonju, resulting in the Battle of Cheopyeong-ni, beginning on February 13th. Once again, UN troops, this time comprising of the US 23rd Infantry Regiment and a French contingent, were overrun by superior numbers of Chinese forces, bent on their destruction. But heavy air and artillery strikes proved the deciding factor and resulted in around 2,000 PVA dead for just 51 UN troops. The battle represented the high-water mark for the Chinese invasion of South Korea, and in the months that would follow, the fight for the peninsula would descend into a bloody slog between the two sides. While UN air power smashed North Korea's infrastructure supporting the conflict,